This week on Body Count, we continue our exploration of Genghis Khan. Hello and welcome to Body Count, the podcast where we believe history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I'm your host, Jessica Manor, and I'm joined once again today by
Frank Garcia. I am back once again, and I'm excited to be here.
Yay! And he will be back lots in the future. So everybody on Twitter, go and give him some love because he is here to stay. We're far enough into the show. I'm done with all explanations, disclaimers, all that kind of stuff officially. Just know we're kicked back on our various couches, about to break down some seriously disturbing history. Only rule we choose when we choose a subject to discuss, someone or a lot of someone's, as is usually the case, die. If you're listening to this episode, go ahead and back it on up. Start with part 1 of Genghis Khan because this has been a multi-part exploration of the life and times of Genghis Khan. And Frank Garcia and I have logged a lot of hours thus far talking about Genghis Khan. But today, Genghis Khan unifies his kingdom and begins building an empire. I feel like all Frank and I have done recently is literally discuss Genghis Khan. But then again, we just kind of want to remind you the secret history could all be bullshit, but we're going to try to kind of fuss out what we have from secondary sources written post-12th century, because it's what we have. Speaking of, again, our source is Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford. This isn't a guy that went and spent, 3 weeks in freaking Mongolia. Jack Weatherford devoted 20 plus years of work on Genghis Khan, and that's why we chose this book as our primary source, but we encourage you to go out and grab the book. We cannot stress to you enough just how much we're really scratching the surface. So, let's get to it. Frank, are you ready?
Yeah, I've been ready since last week, and I'm glad to be back. Also, just want to shoot a quick thank you to everybody. Jessica finally made it official that I'm invited to the team, and I couldn't be more excited. There's been a lot of people, talking to me about it on Twitter and stuff. So I'm really happy to be a part of the team and glad to see where this goes.
We're happy.
Yeah, I know it won't be on all of them, but I know the big ones to help you out with, I'm pretty excited about.
I'm excited too, because this couldn't have gone better. And again, thank you everybody for the outpouring on Facebook. This has had a really good response and we've really enjoyed doing it. So let's get down to business. Temujin Khan has become Genghis Khan officially. He's the undisputed leader of all the steppe with a now vast empire. So what did Genghis or Chinggis Khan choose to do with it? Now, as per usual, Genghis Khan breaks with tradition. He had built a nation, and a new nation needed laws. Aside from being the most kick-ass fierce steppe warrior ever to mount a pony, he was one smart cookie. Genghis knew he had to establish order, and he was a man that was bound and determined to make the world the way he wanted it to be. What all did the new law of Genghis entail? Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't a code of rape, pillage, burn everything to the ground. It was a complex series of laws that we would actually recognize as, in our own code of law today. He built institutions and not just a badass army, though he centralized that bad boy and knew that all of his power derived from it. Most importantly, cowherds and camel boys rose to become generals, which was like step version of CEO. Healthy males 15 to 70 were to be active members of the military, and you moved up or down based on achievement and merit. More interestingly, he gave the most loyal and capable of his friends the units of 10,000. Genghis would give his family much, much smaller units, like from his brothers to his mother to his sons, and all their households and wealth were overseen by his most trusted friends. His family were not permitted to be their own administrators or advisors. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that's actually a good choice because he could see maybe, these people had become used to a certain level of life and living, and he could maybe see problems arising there, which that was smart.
Yeah, it's definitely just trying to keep the peace, amongst everybody, not trying to make one feel like more than the other. And I always think it's good to go back, when we look at the members of the military that he recruited, like he didn't just like look at them and say, you know what, I think you'll be good for the spot. Like he knew when he either was battling against them or, teaching them what they needed to know from his point of view, like he could learn that they were teachable, that they would be good at the position. He just didn't put somebody there just to put them there.
Exactly. And I think that's like, it's part of what sets him so far apart and part of why I believe he was so very successful. Genghis instilled his law ideas from other sedentary civilizations, but improved rather upon existing steppe traditions. And the great law of Genghis Khan wasn't set in stone. No, it evolved and could change rather like our laws today. In some ways, it's a bit better as his government didn't have their hand in the cookie jar 24/7, but rather concentrated on regulating the most troublesome parts of the day-to-day steppe grind. Because again, we're going to remind you guys, this was unprecedented to have this entire civilization put together out of all these different nations and tribes. They had been a state for 2.5 seconds, and instead of just sit there and chill out, the first thing he starts doing is like making law and order, which again, I think shows some incredible foresight. It's just, I want people to understand that this wasn't just some barbarian king. He was very much, and in a lot of ways, way more advanced than what was existing as a sovereign in Europe at the time.
Yeah, he definitely knew what his goals were and what he wanted to achieve. And, now that he had some people that were out of the way, he could finally pursue it and give it 100% without having to war with people constantly and, try to make people believe that he was worth their time.
Exactly, which is going to make a big difference. So what were some of these laws? Let's look at them kind of really quickly. For example, as long as men were kidnapping women, there was always going to be fighting among his newly united tribes and nations. So first law he made, like 86ing the kidnapping of women. Also, you could argue that he was sitting where he was because someone just had to kidnap Borta. So lesson learned in his case, technically the hard way. I mean, he would have probably continued to live a peaceful, quiet life and never have been Genghis Khan if that hadn't occurred in the first place. And I kind of always think he wanted to just live a peaceful existence, but it just wasn't in the cards for Genghis Khan. Plus, the paternity questions raised by the kidnapping of women plagued his own household as well as many of his followers. So Genghis Khan forbade the abduction and enslavement of any fellow Mongol as well, which, hey, baby steps, guys. Very different time. Sure, there were a lot of other people that were abducted and enslaved in the course of this story, but never a Mongol against a Mongol. That was done. But again, he knew from his own experience in captivity just how deadly and deep animosity and the need for vengeance through violence could run. Again, walking, talking example frickin' A is himself. And God knows the new members of the nation of Genghis Khan's steppe nation, steppe tribes didn't need a reason to fight. They would literally just make one up. So Genghis sought to remove every source of dissension between his followers, and fighting over legitimacy was a surefire way to start some shit. So every child was declared legitimate, whether born of a wife or a concubine. Haggling over women like camels caused men to fight over perceived dishonor and raised tempers, so Genghis Khan forbade the selling of women into marriage. Also, he can't have been crazy about how long he had to work and wait for Borta, his ride or die wife. So I think those are all really interesting, and whether or not it was I know a lot of people are going to say, oh, well, what a women's right issue. Whether it was, whether it wasn't, it was a way to make everybody get along, which again, some serious foresight. You could tell he'd been thinking about this for quite some time. So next up on the plate, adultery. Now, not in like the biblical sense, because he believed that what happened in your gers was your business. And it was a common practice for people to sleep with people willy-nilly within their own units, as long as it wouldn't cause like scary Habsburg incest. Rather, you couldn't like sleep with the wives of men outside your ger or households. And as long as it didn't cause public strife between families, it didn't necessarily rank as a crime. Theft, that, however, was a big fucking no-no under the rule of Genghis Khan's Great Laws. Theft of animals was considered wrong, but people still did that shit anyway, among day-to-day life. So think of the animals stolen from like Genghis Khan's own family and how they suffered at the theft of their animals when they were down and out when he was growing up. Therefore, yak wrestling or any other animal wrestling was considered a capital offense, which that kind of sounds familiar for Americans. I believe that up until 100 years ago, you probably were still hanged for that in the state of Texas. He instituted a nationwide sort of adult lost and found system that spread the width and breadth of the empire. You so much as found goods, money, or God have mercy on your soul, an animal, and didn't turn it into the proper authority, you were treated as a thief. Pretty much if you stole anything, your ass was like steppe grass. People often bitched about and fought over hunting grounds as well, and Genghis was not having people fighting anything but an external enemy from now on. So, law time. He forbade the hunting of wild animals during the breeding season, March to October. Now, this allowed healthy breeding, provided, kind of a winter safety net, and hunters were limited to taking what they needed to survive food-wise only. The law even told you how to hunt particular animals and to butcher them so that nothing went to waste. Genghis Khan had learned pretty early on, again, because of the way that he grew up, waste not, want not. Now, sex, personal property, and food were reasons that people fought, but Genghis had also experienced fighting over religion among nations and tribes in his lifetime. So he made religious freedom in his kingdom absolute. No questions asked. That was not something he was going to have people fighting over. And to promote that, he gave all religious leaders and their property exemption from taxes and public service. And to promote related professional service, he extended that to include undertakers, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and scholars, which I also find incredibly interesting. So here's a guy that was basically practicing early conservationism with the hunting policies, now complete and total religious freedom, which didn't exist in empires of that day. That's an older idea so much as a newer one that you experience on a worldwide scale. We still struggle from that today. And not only that, to be that interested in building a state, to know that there was exemption from public service, from taxes, that would encourage religious leaders, but it would also encourage doctors, lawyers, things and practices that people need, so that people had a reason to not just go jump into the army and that be the only thing anybody does anymore, which I found like incredibly interesting. It just kind of blows my mind that he, again, you could tell the entirety of his life, he had really been thinking about and thinking on these different things. Now, to the office of Khan, he made a ton of laws about succession because, he knew he wasn't going to live forever. Now, the Khan must be elected by a gathering majority of the whole nation, or a hurlutai, which to try to claim the seat without the majority support, and you were as good as dead. It was a capital offense. And to stop his family knocking each other off for the top seat, that death penalty to the Khan's family could only be administered by a hurlutai of the Khan's family. One member of Genghis Khan's family couldn't order another to be killed on behalf of the state without the family majority, which essentially outlawed seizing family power the way he had by offing his own half-brother. And I think that's really interesting too. It seems like a lot of these laws he made out of what he may or may not have felt were mistakes on his part and things that had affected him coming to power the way that he had to come to power.
Yeah, it's like he's taking what he saw that didn't work and is like trying not to, repeat it as best as he can with the resources that he has. Just a side note, I was taking some notes and I came over some information where, we're talking about the laws right now and usually there's a book or something or some kind of documentation that talks about it, but when I was doing my research, it looked like there was some secret written code that what we're talking about now, where they called it like the Yasser or something like that. Does that ring a bell with you?
Yes.
So that was like the name of what they called all of their laws, and I find that pretty interesting that they wanted to keep it secret but known, like they didn't want other nations to know about it, but they wanted everyone in their tribe to understand it at the same time.
Yes, I thought that was super interesting too. It's almost in a way protecting that the way they didn't want anybody on the outside to know their organization or how it was they worked, but yet they all knew these things by absolute heart, which again, it's just a testament to what he really built and the confidence that these people really, really seem to have in Genghis Khan. The more I learn about this dude, I'm just like, man, like he was on it.
Unfortunately, they really didn't find anything of it. Like we have a Declaration of Independence and we know exactly where it's at, who, what, when, where, and why about it. But unfortunately, the Mongolians and Genghis Khan didn't preserve this kind of scroll or a codex or anything. So we don't really officially know what all laws they had, but at least, some of the common ones had a few excerpts about them that can kind of give us an idea of what they generally thought was acceptable and what was not.
I know. And I wish, like, I would be very interested to have seen what everything is, because you're exactly right. These are the only things that we have that we're talking about, but who knows exactly how deeply he had codified everyday life. And I will always, always wonder about that. It's just really, really interesting to me because, again, this took an incredible amount of work, an incredible amount of thought from a person who was not capable of reading or writing. Like that, to me, that's pretty impressive.
It almost gives you the idea that he wanted it secret or hidden for a reason, just like when he dies, we talked about it in the first couple of episodes that he wanted nobody to know anything about where he was at or,
Heck,
so
what he even looked like. So
yeah,
it's really interesting. And I will always kind of wonder what the motivation for that was. It's beyond me. But more importantly, when we're talking about this law, since we're talking about these laws, and I thought this took a lot of the day-to-day policing out of things. I thought this was really interesting. So these new laws level charges at a group or family as a whole, not at the individual that necessarily committed that crime. Individuals were not given identity outside the family or the service groups to which they belonged. Basically, you fuck up and your unit, family, or professional was all collectively held responsible. Whether the family or a squad of soldiers, you bore the same liability for each other's actions, which effectively leads to families and civic groups self-policing. It was the duty of the entire community to uphold the rule of law and social justice, not just the state. But enforcing the law and abiding by it began with the Khan. Genghis Khan declared that the rule of law trumped even sovereignty. So he himself, which was something no other civilizations had yet to achieve, including and I'm all important, like rolling my eyes, Europe. Everywhere else, the sovereign was above the law, but not on the steppe. Now, granted, this novel step only lasted about 50 years after his death, but still, as far as history in the world goes, it was a start, and it was something really, really novel. So that also struck me as really interesting and really important, that this was important enough to him that he was going to abide by it too. It was what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And throughout the entirety of his life, he 110% stuck to the laws that he made and ruled himself and his own household that way. Now, to keep up with all these laws, boom, a writing system was created. And then to administer and to track all these laws, he created judges, which again, this is a tribe that just 20 years earlier were hundreds of different tribes warring with each other. There was no judge, there were no laws, there was no administrative system to hand out fair judgment. So it's incredible how fast he was able to do this. And then to spread this and all this information administration far and wide from, and this is a sizable kingdom already at this time, creates a postal system. Now, not just for the law, but to communicate far and wide across, again, this insanely sized kingdom, the local people supplied the stations and the military supplied the riders. You could even serve in the postal system network in lieu of the military. It was that important to Genghis Khan and to his people, which to me, that's always going to be one of the most incredible achievements, to know that none of this means nothing if you can't spread the word of it far and wide and enforce it.
Yeah, I think it's pretty impressive that, even after still establishing this nation that's, pretty new, he put in a postal system. I'm just curious to know if those same laws of theft apply to postal theft, or if we could even apply something like that today, just with how many people go up to your door and will steal just about anything.
Oh, I know. My guess is that probably didn't happen too often in Genghis Khan's kingdom. Because I'm going to imagine, again, theft of any kind, if you didn't turn it in, and there are administrators set up to which you went and turned in anything you found. So I can only imagine, especially when you consider the size of this postal network. So each station was around 20 miles apart and required a minimum of 25 families near it to maintain and operate just one. So that gives you an idea of the kind of operation they were running, the kind of huge postal system that we're actually looking at. And unfortunately, the total number of stations at any given time in operation was so top secret, the information has just been completely lost to time. So we could be talking about hundreds, thousands of these. If they're 20 miles apart through the width and breadth of this empire, I cannot even imagine the kind of organization, how quickly overnight it almost went to a society that we would recognize today almost. Yeah. It's incredible. This guy was anything in the world but lazy, that's for damn sure.
He just wanted to succeed, and he knew that with the right timing and the right people to back him, that he was going to be able to do it.
Yep, it's incredible. Back to kind of that same government, how do you ensure all these military and civilian personnel stay loyal to you, no matter how friendly they may seem or helpful they've been in the past? Age-old answer to that question, hostage taking. But what was different about Genghis Khan? He didn't threaten to kill his hostages. No, that wasn't the threat. He gave them the choicest positions in his personal household guard and service, giving every family one throughout the kingdom almost a pretty much direct line straight to him of communication. And second, if their family member misbehaved, well, Genghis Khan would simply replace the person misbehaving with his hostage and kind of do the whole thing over again. And it ended up being far more effective. People were less willing to sacrifice their own life, as it turns out, than the lives of hostages. And then furthermore, his elite unit of bodyguards as a unit outranked everyone in every other unit. That means the lowest man on the totem pole in his guard outranked even the highest ranked of anyone else in any other unit, thereby making him and those closest to him the center of every operation, be it civil or military. Like, how much he really, really thought this shit out. But even Genghis Khan couldn't have foreseen how bored a horde of nomadic warrior people would be in peacetime. And this is interesting because I think it's the one thing he didn't think out. He thought everybody would kind of almost be like him and just happy to live in peace. But no matter how much you give everybody, this is hundreds of years they had spent where you woke up every day and you just went to war of some kind.
Yeah, I mean, in the back of his mind, there was a little bit of worry about something. I mean, you could never think promising thoughts about living on the steppes and someone not just raiding you or people turning against you. But his people believed in him, so it's stuff we don't know. We can only guess or opinionate about it, but
exactly. So, to that point, after about 4 or 5 years in of all this peaceful empire making, people are starting to get bored. So a shaman from his tribe thought he might have a go for the title, but Genghis Khan grew wise to that game, thanks in large part to Borta's intervention. So he broke the man's back, and he, like Jamaica, was left to die. There's got to be a more efficient way to get down to business, guys. Like, breaking someone's back just seems like so much work to me when you could just take him outside and, I don't know, shoot him, do anything else. But that seemed to be what his style was. But nonetheless, this little episode had kind of shown Genghis Khan the dangers of, again, resting on your laurels. And it had become pretty clear to him, if his followers weren't out making gains, getting goods for themselves, there would always be someone, including maybe his own family, that would always want to be taking a shot at the title. People just cannot help it. I don't understand it. He doesn't seem like a guy that I would want to mess with, but whatever. Genghis had learned perhaps the oldest lesson in the long history of nation building. Without an outside enemy threatening everyone's health and home, why would people need to stay together? So, Genghis Khan inevitably started looking for an outside threat. But problem was, there was no tribe of great distinction left. He'd sort of crushed all the nearest ones. So as a little distraction for a time, he sent his son to an area in modern Siberia and kind of brought them to heal, brought in some new recruits for the army. The intermarriage, they got a ton of rare furs, birds, forest goods. Still, it wasn't much to be gained in furs and feathers. And Genghis Khan was far more interested on getting his hands on some sweet, sweet manufactured goods that he couldn't produce. We're talking metal, textiles, novelty items, etc. He hadn't gotten tastes of such items, but he wanted them en masse. They'd had it here and there from raiding the Tatars, but all of that had kind of run out. So after their conquests, tribal annexes, the Mongols were very aware that they were technically poor as shit compared to the agricultural civilizations they had thus far conquered. Gold, silver, pearls, yada yada. They didn't know how to weave, and so only wore leather, fur, and felt. So textiles, think silk, brocade, damask, satin, etc., were a hell of a thing to be taken and to be captured. But maybe the most prize of all the shit that they could get off of sedentary civilizations. Now, Genghis Khan needed external enemies, but he was tired of being poor as well. So beyond the Gobi Desert, that was his southern border, was like the Amazon.com of the day. The all-important Silk Route, think like Marco Polo style, and its wealth of goods. And almost as soon as it caught the attention of Genghis Khan that this thing existed, opportunity came a-knocking, we'll say.
Yeah, and if you know any like past history about the Silk Road, I mean, you probably know that there was just thousands of things just being passed along that road all the time, being transported back and from, big towns and places that at this point in time on the Silk Road, these places were a little bit better established than the Mongols were, and they were able to properly designate routes and get goods to where they needed to be. And for him to see an opportunity here, he's just like saliving in his mouth. Like he's like,
Yeah.
oh, this is what I need.
Yeah, that's exactly how it was. He took once he knew that this was existed and all of these things were moving between basically the Chinese empires through to the Islamic empires and then all the way to the West, like as far as Bennett, like it was no contest after that. He was going to control that trade. So that takes us to the year 1210. Genghis Khan is 48, and no one really gives a shit about this new kingdom of horse lords and what they thought of as barbarians living in Mongolia. Still, there was a man known as the Golden Khan of the Jurchid that really liked to have everyone far and wide just like blow him and pay homage to him in his capital city of Chengdu, which is actually modern day Beijing. Now, the Jurchid dynasty had been around about 100 years, ruling modern day, what would be modern day Inner Mongolia and northern China. But they got their start as a tribal people from the forests of Manchuria, which the Jurchid thought granted them sovereignty over all steppe tribes that there were. And he had come to insist that Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan, submit and basically declare that the Mongols themselves were a vassal nation of the Jurchid, kind of like the Naimon, Tatars, and Kariad had done before him, which had kept this control over the steppe tribes, not by being badasses, that wasn't the Jurchid's thing really, but by controlling the flow of goods from the Silk Route that were being taken into this general area. So military prowess and getting your people the good stuff was how you pretty much stayed Khan before Genghis came along. There were two ways Genghis could get his hands on the goods his people wanted. He could submit as a vassal like the southern tribes had, or he could just kick their ass and take control of the flow of goods. Now, based on the fact that Genghis was already looking for an enemy in any case, take a guess what his answer was about to be. Oh, I feel sorry for these people. So not only that, but Genghis didn't care for the fucking Jurchid at all. He had a much closer kinship to a group called the Khitan, who the Jurchid had actually conquered those 100 years ago. Not only conquered, but continued to degrade. And Genghis knew it was because as soon as he had become Genghis Khan, the Khitan had started flocking to Genghis Khan in droves. 4 high court Jurchid officials had deserted to Genghis and urged him to actually attack the Jurchid already, but Genghis had stayed his hand, kind of fearing a trap in that. But in 1210, the old and very powerful Golden Khan was dead. And it was his young son, new to the throne, trying to prove himself by making a show of demanding submission from the great Genghis Khan. Because word had kind of gotten around about this ass kicker in the north, an ass kicker who was never going to be anyone's slave ever again. He was done with that. And they were about to get a kick-ass answer. So when asked to submit by this glittering envoy, he spit to the south and cussed the man and the Golden Khan up one side and down the other, then just mounted up and just rode north, covering the envoy and everybody in dust. So that essentially meant shit was on. A Chinese scholar recorded the new Golden Khan mocking news of the Mongol advance. Our empire is like the sea. Yours is but a handful of sand. How can we fear you? Which, he was about to learn the fucking hard way. I can tell you that. I will never understand and we're going to be wrapping this up hopefully at the end of next week, why it is that everybody just always felt so confident that they were just going to spit on and deter Genghis Khan. Obviously, this was not a guy to be messed with if the past 20-something years have taught us nothing. It's amazing to me. Somebody's just always got to try him.
Yeah, it's like if we think about movies and past history, every time that one top leader dies, there's always the next son or, somebody who's got to prove themselves when there's no really need to, but they feel like they have to. So let's go start a war and try and kick somebody's ass that we know nothing about or has a past to try and prove dominance when that probably wasn't needed,
That's exactly right. Wasn't needed, and they had vastly overestimated Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. So the area to the south it already contained about a third of the world's population at the time. So the 50 million strong nation of the Jurchen made only the second largest of many kingdoms in what is now modern day China. There were a bunch of smaller nation states to conquer basically along the way as Genghis Khan and the Mongols started marching toward the Jurchen capital, and portions of the trade route to already be seized. But more importantly, it kind of allowed Genghis Khan to learn how to attack walled cities on his way with fortresses, and moats. And it was just something that he had never encountered before. He started with a group called the Tengut, who had an army of around 150,000. And this is what is amazing to me. It was twice the size of the army Genghis Khan had with him. So not only is he marching against a nation of 50 million strong, he's doing it with maybe 80,000 to 100,000 people. I can't believe that they achieve what they're going to achieve with such small numbers.
I definitely think it goes to show like how well trained and how well put together his nation was to be able to fight that kind of army, double the size of yours, and just be able to essentially dominate or hang with them and then, finally make it through.
And to just crush them. It's incredible.
Yeah.
But despite the size of the Tengut army, of course, no match for Genghis Khan in the end. And Genghis Khan was, again, having to learn a lot on the way because unlike people that grew up in cities, like this was all new to the Mongols, everything about it. So not only that, they had to learn classic siege pretty quickly, classic siege techniques, but then what's more impressive is they started thinking up all sorts of new shit on the way. For example, diverting river channels to flood cities. That is pretty amazing. Like, they divert. Who's sitting there and thinking, this river's near here. I'm tired of waiting. We could just flood them out. Let's change the direction of the river. Oh, that worked. To me, it's a testament to just how really ingenious this guy was. Like, he was willing to try anything and try it once. Incredible.
The surprising part to me is just how they're having to adjust, being a little bit more classy than they're used to be because, you come from living on the steppes where it's just constant on the go. You never get the chance to settle down. It's just really interesting to continue from here to hear how they adjust to different life. We talk about the wars and conquering and stuff, but how these people had to just adjust pretty much their whole lives to everything.
And so quickly. Like, I can say that's one thing that I find really, really interesting too, is just the fact that they weren't afraid of change. Whatever had to be done, they were going to do. It's amazing, including diverting rivers to flood cities. Incredible. So, another thing that was really interesting about the Mongols, they only carried what they needed when they set out to conquer with Genghis Khan. And that's where the army had another advantage no other civilization had. There was no infantry. There was no, long groups of people walking. Everybody was mounted. There was all cavalry, which meant that they could move like fast as fuck, faster than Kenny Powers can throw a baseball fast. Like, the Mongols also traveled without a supply train, which couldn't slow them down. So again, armies of the day would have behind them all these carts with goods and food and, massive amounts of tents and all this kind of stuff. But the Mongols just found what they needed on the way. So they could constantly be on the move, and they could constantly move fast. Not only that, but when it was time to stop for the evening, Mongol camps were set up in a precise pattern, each time identical, so that newly arriving soldiers always knew where to report and what was where. So each unit traveled with its own medical unit as well, usually with conscripted Chinese doctors to tend all sick and wounded. Now, the Mongols, Genghis Khan included, were for the most part illiterate. Reading and writing wasn't their thing, so all communications between units was oral. So the Mongols used a set group of songs in which only a few words ever had to change depending on what the message was. Therefore, miscommunication was never an issue. Things were never lost, something was never miscommunicated. It is always in these same rhymes, poems, songs with a few words, and there were always a base number of messages that it could possibly be. So that also was really interesting to me, that this group didn't need a written language to communicate. And in a way, it was almost far more effective than what other armies of the day were using. Now, they were on foreign soil, but that didn't really make a difference to Genghis Khan, or his men for that matter. They had spent their entire life fighting, but they had yet to go up against cities with walls this size. The Jurchid knew what they were about. They knew how to build a city. They knew how to build a highly defensible city. Again, Genghis Khan had an answer for that too. He would fall back on his old tried and true system of propaganda. Win the war before you even have to fire a shot. Create some mayhem, chaos, confusion, and instill some hardcore fear. So a lot of times they would arrive at a place and the gates were already open to them. And they were very, very benign on these cities that they took. They just kind of took them in as already part of the nation. But that kind of put aside, there were always people that still, held out. And again, nobody could spread fear like Genghis Khan could spread fear. He was very good at breaking people's spirits. So if he couldn't break down some city walls on the way to the Golden Khan's house, no worry. Genghis Khan would just quickly disperse to the countryside and wreak absolute havoc until a city opened its gates thinking the coast was clear, that they had gone to pillage the countryside, but had just left the city. And then in 2 seconds, the entire Mongol army would reappear and just be on them and through the city gates. Genghis Khan also understood the value of exploiting social unrest. Any rift or internal strife he heard about, he was basically going to use. So he immediately began dividing the Khitan from the Jurchid and convincing the Chinese people that the Jurchid had no way to defend them. Again, this was a man who knew his propaganda game. Joseph Goebbels would have been jealous beyond. Genghis Khan and his Mongol army entered the Jurchid stomping grounds, announcing themselves essentially as a liberating versus an invading force that was just hell-bent on restoring the Khitan rulers to their rightful place. The Jurchid had overthrown the Khitan about a century before, and while it's doubtful that they'd actually been any better to the Chinese people than were the Jurchid, no one remembered or cared by this time, and life was shit for most people under the Jurchid yoke. So in 1212, Genghis Khan officially restored the Khitan monarchy as a vassal state of the now official Mongol Empire. But Genghis Khan had no intention of hanging around, and this move was super crucial. The Khitan language was close to that of the Mongols, and the Khitan royal family gave Genghis Khan all he needed to know about a culture he intended to crush if they didn't yield. What he found really interesting were Khitan scholars. He didn't hesitate to put them to work. These scholars and administrators proved super effective in handling the day-to-day running of an empire. And it wasn't lost on Genghis Khan what benefits these scholars could bring to his empire. In fact, after this Jurchid campaign, Genghis Khan made it his practice everywhere his pony did roam to have all scholars brought to him to figure out what their skill was and how he could apply the knowledge to benefit the empire. So if we haven't convinced you after all this time that Genghis Khan, while definitely an ass kicker, was different, this will. Everywhere else in the world, soldiers were taught to die for their sovereign, but that was the very last thing that Genghis Khan wanted. Although I think we've done well at shattering that kind of savage barbarian illusion, every strategy he had was intended primarily to preserve Mongol life. In Europe, for example, hundreds of thousands were sacrificed with, not so much as a how do you do. They didn't really care about their people. But every strategy that Genghis Khan made was intended to preserve Mongol life. More unique, he wouldn't sacrifice a single soldier. And that to me is really, really interesting, just how important that was to him. He was never going to throw his people out as cannon fodder. He tried to learn everything that he could about a place that he was going into, specifically so that he didn't have to lose a single one of his soldiers if he could help it. Which, again, to me, kind of shatters that barbarian illusion that we're always presented with when we think of Genghis Khan. I don't know. I mean, we don't even do that today in the United States of America. So it's just even more interesting to me. He was an interesting guy.
Yeah, I like that he really took care of his soldiers, and the fact that you said that they just didn't go to die just to help their country, but, whether they lost their life or not, that they were very valued. It's just crazy to me how from the very beginning to now, it was all about the people and their way of living, and that no one was better than the other, but they were well valued. Each person was.
Exactly. From the lowest of the low to the highest of the high, he cared about everybody, which, again, we don't have leaders like that today for the most part. So it's really interesting to me that this guy has been painted in such a barbarous light. And don't get me wrong, like we're going to get to some things later. He wasn't always the nicest, sweetest guy in the world. That's for sure. But I think some of that, in the way that Mongols thought, it was very, very unique, again, to anybody else at the time, because there was no honor in fighting. There was no honor in knights. There was none of that false chivalry kind of crap that existed everywhere else. All they cared about was winning, and that was the only goal. They didn't care how victory was achieved either, only that they won. Genghis Khan was willing to use any trick in the book. And again, no chivalry, no false honor codes or blowing smoke up anyone's ass. There was no honor in battle if you lost. Genghis Khan was reported to have said, "There is no good in anything until it is finished." To that point, keep in mind, no trick, no bullshit was beneath the Mongols. And that meant turning what the Jurchid thought was their greatest asset, their population, into their biggest liability. So before having a go at cities, the Mongols cleared out the countryside around them. They conscripted local labor into army force, forcing peasants to be rounded up, 10 of them per soldier. So, you've got 100,000. Each man of that 100,000 had to find and conscript 10 men to them to do things like get food, water, gather materials. And these conscripted workers would also build and work on all these siege engines, and then they would actually be used to push the towers up to the city walls to breach them. Now, the Mongols just couldn't wrap their head around or understand these grass-eating sedentary farmers. They treated them as they treated herd animals. A traditional army of the time would have used these villages as something to be looted, raped, pillaged, but not Genghis Khan. He already knew he was low in numbers compared to anywhere, pick a place that they were going to invade. So he put these great number of peasants to strategic use against the Jurchid. So Mongols used stampeding animals to their advantage against enemies on the steppe, Again, against the Jurchid, they simply used their own population. So units of Mongol warriors would set fire to villages and scatter the residents, who then fled in all directions, clogging the highways, which cut off all Jurchid supply trains. More than 1 million of these refugees fled to cities, which would eat up the city's seized resources and create like absolute chaos in the cities before the Mongols even arrived. Armies at the time were usually followed by trains of refugees. Genghis Khan was preceded by them. And this is where Genghis Khan does earn some of his scary ass reputation. Displaced peasants were used by the Mongols as human shields and living battering rams against city gates. The Mongols didn't care about life if it wasn't Mongol or official vassal state lives. Remember, it was about preserving Mongol life to them. So as captives were slaughtered in battle by the Jurchid trying to get to the Mongols, the bodies were used to fill moats, form paths over defensive holes made by the enemies. And I mean, that's fucking brutal. So literally, all the dead, they would just push into the moat and then wheel their siege engines right over them. You can see where some of
the brutality.
Yeah, it starts to come out and you start to kind of get a glimpse of it. I mean, the guy wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, and we never claimed that he was by any means. But to be fair, nobody in the 1200s was sunshine or rainbows.
Yeah, which, I mean, personally, I think it's genius what he's doing. Yes, it is inhumane that he's using people as human shields and battering rams. But at the same time, they didn't want to follow him. So if you're not going to follow me, why should I preserve you? You know?
Exactly. He always gave everybody one shot. You could always have come to me. You could have always just bent the knee. Anybody that didn't, after that, they were not human to him. But I agree. It is absolutely ingenious.
Because he didn't waste any of his own people to have to sacrifice when he had these other people, these peasants that were sacrificial almost.
Exactly. That meant nothing to him. They weren't his people. He wasn't responsible for taking care of them. So, trapped in their cities by the Mongols with food sources depleted by refugees, the Jurchid soon became cannibal Jurchid. And this action led to some full-scale urban center, good old-fashioned fucking mutinies as rebel peasants turned on Jurchid officials that couldn't protect, feed, or manage their people within these cities. So Genghis Khan also understood very well divide and conquer. That was his plan all along. And if peasant uprisings weren't terrifying enough for Jurchid rulers, they definitely weren't expecting the Mongols to be some dead clever bastards, because they were. For example, when they caught the enemy out, they would rush them in all directions, and just as soon as they struck, like poof, ninja dust, disappear. So this confused the Jurchid, who were left messed up with no idea how to counter an attack like this. They'd never experienced anything like this. Originally, the Mongols had to learn how to assault a city with walls. And impressive as diverting a river is, that's a hell of a lot of work. So instead, Genghis learned to build siege engines from conscripted Chinese engineers that included catapults and trebuchets, hurling fire and stones at city walls. He created ballistas, which are the things that shoot the giant arrows, which could damage structures, more or less kill a ton of men or animals that may be in their way. And then the fire lance, which was adapted from Chinese fireworks and was used to disorient the enemy, start fires, and continued to evolve kind of for military purposes. It was a Chinese flamethrower and a precursor to the cannon, which is something else the Mongols would eventually give us. Now, Genghis Khan rewarded defecting engineers and conscripted them into military service as part of a newly developed engineering unit, which would become permanent parts of the army. If Genghis Khan couldn't draw the Jurchid from their cities, he got even more clever with it. He would pretend to retreat, leaving all equipment and stores just where they were laying. So tents, food, everything. He would just have everybody disappear. And the Jurchid would think, hey, coast is clear. So they'd leave the city, throw the gates wide open, and start loading all these goods into carts, which they would start taking them into the city, of course, completely clogs the road in, and gates wide open. All of a sudden, all the Mongols would fall upon them and completely capture and sack the city. That, to me, is absolute genius.
Yes, I was actually just about to say that, and you took the words right out of my mouth. It's almost like almost like a Trojan horse, they left it there, let the people accept it as like all right, we're done, you won, as a gift, and then boom, right then and there, sack the city.
Yeah. Oh man, that's clever. So basically, they just go out of sight of anywhere of the city and just wait until a scout would be like, all right, let's do this. Yeah. And then boom.
I feel like it's kind of sad to see some of this engineering, technology that they built is kind of lost history. There's not a lot about it, and you can't really find a lot about it. So we don't really know, as much as they kept things secrets, there's not a lot of information on it, unfortunately.
I know, and I would be really, really interesting because I would think, because Genghis Khan is Genghis Khan, not only did he build these things that already existed, but he really improved upon them, I'm sure, to deadly effect. But you're right. I mean, there's just so much secrecy we don't know. So in that, this fleeing and this coming back, for sedentary people, to flee was to lose. But for nomadic Mongols that were always on the move, it didn't matter if they were fleeing or if they were charging. To kill the enemy, you were winning, which was different than any sedentary civilization. Because you think about it, I mean, to leave your city behind is a loss. The Mongols didn't have that worry. They didn't care about any of that. They were there to kill you. Now, when they did draw out the enemy, they attacked as if they were herding their animals. So they would string the enemy out in long lines that were just impossible to defend. Even when they were routed, they were always ready. So let's say there's a patrol group out, they get caught by some Jurchid, so they take off, the Jurchid are chasing them. The Mongols carried disposable valuables with them that they would drop on the ground when being pursued. The enemy would always break ranks, to stop and try to get all these goods, which would leave the patrol, or like all the patrols, free to escape. Another thing to me that was absolutely genius, because he was just counting on, he knew how people were. They were going to be greedy. So here, drop this stuff, like you're going to get away scot-free. But this one really gets me. And again, I don't know how true this is. It is from the secret history, but if it's true, it might be one of the smartest things I've ever heard. So one story even maintains that the Mongols captured a convoy with a high-ranking official that was on his way to a besieged city. Supposedly, one of the Mongols, familiar with the language, dressed in the man's clothes, took the official papers, went to the city in the official's place. When he arrived, the Mongols lifted the siege and disappeared, like they were wont to do. Once inside the city, the Mongol fooled the local officials into believing they had defeated the Mongols. The pretender oversaw the disarming of the city that day, then sent word to his Mongol pals, and the Mongols fell on the city, which was now ripe for the picking. And I picked a couple of these stories with things like that, but there are hundreds that you could choose from. These ones seem to be the most honest to goodness, like, they didn't seem to have any myth around them. These things seem to be recorded in a semi-serious way and recorded in several different places. So that is just so interesting to me because, again, it wasn't just about, I'm going to show up and be brutal as I can be. It was literally, they would trick the enemy into getting exactly what they wanted because their goal wasn't honor in battle, chivalrous, trying to do this, trying to do that. Their goal was to win. And that meant killing everybody, including, and most importantly, all the aristocracy they could get their hands on. That is so incredibly impressive to me.
Yeah. Or just the fact that, I kind of got a little bit into that story that you just mentioned. What if this was somebody that had joined the empire behind Genghis Khan and, he kind of used them against the high ranking official to, figure out more than what he knew already. But, it's still very impressive that I just wish that there was so much more detail with the history behind Genghis Khan.
I know, because just that kind of intelligence and that kind of it's just amazing to me.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. Now, all of these tactics take us to 1214, when Genghis Khan, smug as a bug, began his siege finally on the court of the Golden Khan. Now, there had already been a palace coup, and the once proud Golden Khan couldn't see his way to fighting it out. He agreed to a settlement in which he would be a vassal of Genghis Khan, so other way around. Now, the Golden Khan gave the Mongols massive amounts of silk, silver, gold, 3,000 horses, 500 young men and women. The Golden Khan also had to give a royal princess as a new wife for Genghis Khan. The Khitan were restored to much of their original kingdom, and the Jurchid would be allowed to keep a much, much smaller kingdom. But the Mongols had no intention of hanging around. So long as they got their goods, they didn't really want to be bothered with setting up their Mongol government there, and were content to let everyone rule themselves, just so long as they coughed up their shit and paid their taxes as vassals. And it would have ended there, except the Jurchid, as we have learned, are some really proud, like Richard Noggins, some real dickheads. So almost as soon as the Mongols withdrew, they started to renege on the deal, thinking Genghis Khan wouldn't come back. Despite 3 years of being on the road, and trust that the Mongol army was really ready to go home, didn't matter. They reorganized and turned that shit right back around. And this time, there was no mercy. The city was sacked and looted for everything that it was worth. The Jurchid knew now what it meant to be like truly, really punished by Genghis Khan. It was pure, unadulterated, just slaughter. And once it became clear it was over, he didn't even bother to see the rest of the thing through. He just left his generals in charge to finish up the job. Starts heading home. But on the way, they had one final punishment for the Jurchid. At this point, his army would now be coming and going back and forth to the land of the Jurchid because they broke faith, and Genghis Khan was done being uncomfortable when he was coming and going. Not really like his super pissed off style, So Mongols like to move anywhere they wished and to have wide open pastures for their animals, sort of what they were used to on the steppe. So they churned up all the land behind them on their way home so that it would return to pasture. And this would prevent any of the Jurchid peasants returning to villages and fields. And to prevent that, they removed everything, tore down every structure, every wall, turned everything to dust. So pretty much they left a wide open road from the steppe all the way to the capital of the Jurchid. And the Mongols laid just absolute waste to everything that there was on the way home. They left nothing. So they killed hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. But Genghis Khan was now in complete control of the Silk Route between the Chinese empires and the Islamic empires of Central Asia. His empire was growing, and he wasn't even close to done yet, despite his advancing age. But we will tell that story next week for the conclusion of our series on Genghis Khan. So, Frank, what are your thoughts?
Well, we finally got what people wanted to believe, that he was ruthless and brutal. We finally got to that point, and we were kind of making him seem like he was this nice guy the whole time, but we finally get to the part where he didn't want to put up with the bullshit anymore, and so he just went on that tirade tangent to take over things. Ooh. But can we really complain? These people deserved it, and they had it coming. They wouldn't listen. They wouldn't follow his role. They just kept backstabbing him every point they could. So it's one of those things where it was much deserved, in my opinion.
I agree, because not only did he give him a chance the first time when he already came and asked, basically said, "You're going to be our slaves." Nah, I don't think so. So he marched in there. But then he went ahead and agreed to be like, all right, fine. We'll leave your stuff. We'll stop what we're doing, but you're going to be our vassal and you're going to pay us money and you're going to pay us your taxes. But just as soon as he was gone, as soon as his back was turned, like they just kept it up. And so I agree. Well deserved. Like, you made your bed, time to lie on it. Like, lie in it.
Yeah, it just seems like the people at this time just didn't want to learn, you know? But at the same time, I don't think they had the competency to understand that as what we do in real life day.
Yeah, I 110% agree with that. Like 110%. So we ran a little long today. We're going to skip our counterculture and go ahead and kind of wrap this up. All right. Thank you guys so very much for listening. Please, please, please go subscribe, rate, review. If you like the show, we drop every Wednesday anywhere that you listen to podcasts. We're at Body Count Pod on Instagram and Twitter. Body Count Pod on Facebook. I'm at Jessica B. Manor on Twitter and Instagram. Be aware, I'm largely a Twitter person. I'm gonna kind of continue to try to do a little better on Instagram, guys. Then, Frank, where do people find and follow you at?
Mostly for the body count stuff, I'm on Twitter and Instagram. Instagram is at the Frankie Garcia, and then Twitter is at the Frank_Garcia. I know those are a little hard to understand and figure out, but you know, Jessica is pretty good about sharing my stuff, and so is everybody else. So just find me there on Twitter and hit me up if you have any questions on podcasts or any additional questions outside of the Genghis Khan stuff that you would like answered.
And like, he straight up will answer them, guys. One smart dude, but also that, like, if you need podcast recommendations or anything like that, Frank is also a great person to go to. So definitely come find us, check us out, follow us on social media. Do go and rate and review. And then we are getting ready to drop all of our Patreon stuff as well. And we'll put some more of that information out as we get everything up and running. So I think that does it for this week. Come and join us next week when we kind of finish up all of our information on Genghis Khan, and it only gets more brutal from here. So from us to you, we will talk to you next week.